I'd like to draw your attention this evening to 2 Kings chapter 21 to begin with. We're going to look at more than just chapter 21, but I do want to call your attention there at least to get started, and we'll move on from there. But let me just kind of ask you a question while you're finding that. Have you ever prayed a prayer for your family that ended up turning out bad for them? Maybe it's a particular person. Maybe it was for your family in general. Just a variety of things. From even a pastor's perspective, maybe you could say, Lord, please work this out. I think this is where we're supposed to go. And then if you do, sometimes there have been problems because that was not a good fit. That was not what God had in mind, even though maybe we meant well. Other times, maybe it'd even be, praying for a promotion for ourselves or maybe for our family, for our children or someone. And then you find out later on, it seems as though, that wasn't a good fit. Maybe they've been missing church or they've kind of been lifted up in pride, or they're more greedy than what I remembered them being. And so that's another one of those cases. Sometimes it can even be praying for health. And then in the long run, the one you're praying for, maybe they were healed, but then they turned their back on God. I know of one case in particular for me where maybe I was praying or hoping that God would just do this, and now it seems like it would have been better if He had not answered my prayer, if He had not spared that life because of the end result. Still others maybe would pray that God, please put my children in a good church. That's a great request, right? That's what we would think, that surely God will respond. Surely God would see that as being His will. But if they get into a good church, and then because others are doing important things for God, they become maybe careless or indifferent about that, helping out in the church or whatever, because there are plenty of other people to be doing those things, then that's not really the best. Now, again, are any of those prayers wrong? I don't really think they are, as long as they're kept within God's will, and as long as they are really, truly surrendered to God, and Lord, whatever you see as best, this is what it seems like would be best. This is what I would like for you to do, but just do what's right. Sometimes we need a little bit of a checkup when it comes to our desires. And tonight I want to speak to you a little bit on this issue, when my desires hurt others. When my desires hurt others. 2 Kings chapter 21 is our passage to begin with tonight. Manasseh was 12, this is verse number 1. Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hephzibah. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, after the abominations of the heathen, whom the Lord cast out before the children of Israel. For he built up again the high places which Hezekiah his father had destroyed. And he reared up altars for Baal, and made a grove, as did Ahab king of Israel, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served them. And he built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord said, in Jerusalem will I put my name. Now these would be false altars, altars of false gods. Verse number 5, and he built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. And he made his son pass through the fire, and observed times, and used enchantments, and dealt with familiar spirits and wizards. He wrought much wickedness in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger. We don't really see any prayers happening there, right? But that's the foundation of where I feel like we want to focus this evening. The passage is a pretty troubling one. Manasseh was the son of one of the greatest of the kings of Israel. Maybe not David, but right up there. He was one of the great kings, had ruled for quite some time. He ruled well. God had blessed him. God had used him in great ways. And of course, Elisha had been maybe a helper there to some extent. But anyway, now we find Manasseh, who is the son of this great king, and in spite of his heritage, Manasseh reigned for, I believe it was 55 years of just utter wickedness. Now you stop and think about that. I've thought about that recently. We're going through all of the political turmoil ourselves, and sometimes we might feel a little bit like, oh Lord, please have mercy on us. Don't give us the wrong leader. But in this situation here, there may well have been numbers of people who were born under Manasseh's reign and died under Manasseh's reign, never knowing righteousness. At least not as it should have been from the kingdom. This wasn't just a question of political differences. This was outright abomination before God. He's even making his son go through the fire, probably to Moloch. Moloch was an idol that had arms like this and a fire grate in the bottom. They'd put their babies, their small children, in the arms of that god with a fire going. Awful, awful things. And Manasseh was just that sort of man, the son of a great king of Judah. But to get to our main purpose tonight, let's go back to the previous chapter. Because I've already talked about when my desires hurt others, but how does that apply? Where do we find that? Well, in the first few verses of the previous chapter, chapter 20, we read these words. In those days was Hezekiah sick unto death. And the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos, came to him and said unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Set thine house in order, for thou shalt die and not live. Then he turned his face to the wall and prayed unto the Lord, saying, I beseech thee, O Lord, remember now how I have walked before thee in truth and with a perfect heart, and have done that which is good in thy sight. And Hezekiah wept sore. And it came to pass, afore Isaiah was gone out into the middle court, that the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Turn again and tell Hezekiah, the captain of my people, Thus saith the Lord, the God of David thy father, I have heard thy prayer, I have seen thy tears, behold, I will heal thee. On the third day thou shalt go up unto the house of the Lord. And I will add unto thy days 15 years, and I will deliver thee in this city out of the hand of the king of Assyria, and I will defend this city for mine own sake, and for my servant David's sake. And then Isaiah gave him the cure here, and he recovered. I think I said earlier Elisha. It was Isaiah here that was the helper to Hezekiah. So in the midst of all of this, we see that God was coming through. God was doing great things for Hezekiah, and yet we read chapter 21. We read how actually this desire, this prayer from Hezekiah brought about wickedness in the land. If we hadn't had this great answer to prayer here for Hezekiah, the history of Judah may have been so much different, because in those 15 extra years is when Manasseh was born. If Hezekiah had died at his originally appointed time, then Manasseh would not have been born. Who knows who the next king would have been, but perhaps things would have been much, much different. Again, that may seem like it's, how could Hezekiah know? He's just praying for more health and more time to do good things for God. And yet all these different ones that would have had to live under Manasseh's reign, maybe those who had spanned both reigns a little bit, maybe they would have looked back and thought, oh, if only God hadn't answered that prayer. Yes, in reality, God was responding to the desperate prayers of his faithful king. But the results were terrible for countless families in the long run. And really, I have a feeling that Hezekiah, if he had been able to see the future, if he had seen what was going to happen, I don't really think he would have even prayed this prayer. I think he would have just set his house in order and would have died. I'm sure most of us probably have prayers that we've been sending heavenward over the last while. Maybe it's for our nation, maybe it's for our family. And obviously prayers for souls is God's will. He's not willing that any should perish. But let's be so careful that we aren't getting selfish in our prayers. Let's be sure we keep our desires surrendered to God's purpose. He knows what is best. And so let's just look at a few thoughts I want to just share with you quickly. First of all, stay surrendered. Stay surrendered. When you're praying, when you're seeking for God to do something special for you, be surrendered. Now, desires for healing, for other material blessings, they're certainly understandable. I think any of us would pray that God would heal the sick, that God would supply our needs, various things like that. But they must always, always be yielded to God's purposes. We need to recognize what God has in mind. I know we have to couple that also with James 1, I think it's verses about 6 through 8, that says basically, make sure you're committed to what you're praying for. An unstable man is, or a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. And he's referring to prayer there. So make sure you're committed to that prayer, but it all must be done with God's will foremost. For God knows the future. When we pray a prayer that maybe seems legitimate, seems like it's good, this is a wholesome prayer, this is an upright prayer, but God sees the future. God sees how that may work out for evil in the long run. The point is that well-meaning Christians, good, sincere, I think even godly people, obviously Christian should be godly, but I'm talking about, even some really sincere and earnest older saints, we might call them. Sometimes they may pray amiss. Sometimes they may not see exactly how the end result of their prayer being answered would work out. It may not be for the best. We must be careful to keep our own desires in check when we begin longing for things that may not be best according to God's will. Stay surrendered. Lord, it's up to you. It's in your hands. Secondly, seek spirituality. Seek spirituality. In all of our prayers, there should be a recognition of what really matters, what really is important. Really, my life, my health is of little consequence when compared to the good that I do for God or being ready for heaven. And any other thing that I'm praying for, oh Lord, please heal and please keep us from danger and all those things, may not be the best. And we cling to life with both fists, and oh Lord, please spare us from COVID or whatever else it may be. But really, sometimes maybe we show our true focus. Are we focused more on this life, on our health here, than we are on heaven? Now, I will tell you, Hezekiah was fairly young yet. And I'm sure those 15 years were appreciated. I think maybe when he prayed them, he was only 30, I'm not sure, 9 maybe, or something like that. Fairly young. But the good that he did in those years was marred by 55 years of wickedness in his son. Our prayers should not be focused on being healthy, wealthy, and wise. That's not what life's about. Our goal should be pleasing God and doing good for His kingdom. Our prayer should be that God's will is accomplished. Again, that can even apply to our current situation. Sometimes we may pray and fast that God's will be done in our own nation. But, really, though we want God to have mercy on America, is that best for our spiritual situation? Is it best for us to have it easy? To know that God's working it all out? To have good, godly leaders? We have a blight on our nation, in a sense, maybe I would say it that way, with so many that just claim easy Christianity, don't cost us anything. But maybe if God allows us to go through some difficult times, it would actually be for our good. And so let's be careful about our prayers. Oh Lord, I know this has to be your will. And so make sure you work this all out and you got to do just what I think is right. It may not be. So God help us to ultimately be seeking spirituality. And then lastly, if perchance God sees it best for us to suffer, suffer sweetly. Suffer sweetly. If we truly leave our future in God's hands, it may involve suffering eventually. Countless Christians have. I don't think that we should be so self-centered that we think that somehow we would automatically escape. We're some super saint that obviously God can't allow suffering in us. Sometimes it might be for our good. But we must suffer sweetly, even in our times of pain. Really, we don't need to be griping and complaining. I don't know. Obviously, there may be protests and who knows what else coming. But really, sometimes our duty is to be sweet. Our duty is to be spiritual. Our duty is to be surrendered. Don't leave a bad testimony because God didn't answer prayer just like you thought it should be, but simply be surrendered to His will. And so tonight, in conclusion, just a simple little talk, if you want to call it that, little sermonette or whatever. Let's seek to pray only according to His will. I've thought about these poor people that suffered under Manasseh and how many times they maybe wished, oh, I wish Hezekiah hadn't prayed. I wish God hadn't healed him. It would have been better for him to die before that. I don't know, that sounds cruel maybe, but oh, that God would help us to pray according to His will. And so you think about that. Meditate on that a little bit this week. And may God help us to be praying and desiring according to God's plan and His purpose in our lives.